Scorch, one of the most difficult to use Titans in the entire game. Let's break down how best to use him and how to be as effective as possible with him. This is also probably going to be one of the longest Titan guides that I put together, so grab a sandwich and buckle up because I'm about to ramble for decades. Let's get started. The first thing you have to understand about Scorch is that Heat Shield is the most important part of your kit in public matches. While it's a fantastic defensive ability with a long duration, it's critical to recognize just how powerful it is as an offensive tool. Yes, the Heat Shield does damage when you place it directly on top of an opponent. I see too many people that don't realize this, so let's make it abundantly clear. Heat Shield does big damage to targets in melee range. Period. End of discussion. Learn it, live it, love it. Throughout every single clip in this guide, you're going to see me using Inferno Shield, which is the Titan kit that upgrades Heat Shield's damage and duration. I don't feel like any other Titan kit on Scorch is worth using in the majority of situations, unfortunately, but we'll talk about that more later. For now, just remember, we're using Inferno Shield in pretty much 100% of the clips here as they are presented. Here's how I use Heat Shield and find success with it. Generally, holding left stick forward and walking towards a target with Heat Shield up is not quite the best play. Sometimes though, if your opponent is out of position, it's the single most deadly thing you could possibly do to them, so you have to take it when the time is right. Combine shield activation with your dash in order to prevent your target from escaping easily. Next, let's say you're in a relatively close range with an opponent, but not quite in range to get that Heat Shield in to start doing damage. This is where your other two abilities start to come into play, chiefly Incendiary Trap. When you're positioned aggressively with Scorch, oftentimes your goal is not to get an enemy Titan into an Incendiary Trap directly. Your goal in many cases may actually be to predict where the enemy Titan is going to try retreating from you and preparing a trap in that location instead. Try firing incendiary traps behind your target before getting in their face with Thermal Shield, and follow them up until your Titan reaches the periphery of that trap. Just keep on walking with them until your feet are at the edge of that fire. Instead of following them through into your own flames, just use your ranged weapons to get a little bit more damage in on them and then disengage. You should have enough core charge built up by this point to just finish them off with a flame core, or you can instead follow them into the flames if their health is really low. Terminate them inside your own fire. You're going to be immune to all that damage over time that you would otherwise deal to yourself, while simultaneously looking like the coolest Titan in the game, or should I say the hottest. If you hold down the firewall activation key, you can actually ever so slightly slow down its casting animation, a helpful tidbit that might prove useful to you every once in a blue moon. When playing aggressively, the biggest thing to keep in mind about Firewall is that you need to make sure you don't drop it in a location that's going to prevent you from chasing an enemy Titan. Don't drop it in the middle of a narrow hallway when the enemy is running away, because you literally cannot chase them without killing yourself in the process. Just be careful where you put your firewalls. Wait for the enemy to start pushing you in order to drop the firewall in a way that makes sense. If you think that you need to possibly move forward after throwing that firewall, throw it at an angle that's like diagonal to that hallway, so when you cross over it, you're minimizing your time in your own fire, because trust me, you're going to screw this up sometimes, and you're going to lose like 2 bars of health, and you're going to hate your life. Just be careful. That's the best advice I could give you when it comes to using Firewall. When combining all 3 of these abilities together, your Flame Core will be charging incredibly fast. I usually find that it's best to just drop this core as quickly as possible after acquiring it, because most of the time if you build the core fast in your opponents, like you go from 0 to 100 really quickly, your opponents are in such a bad position that you can steamroll through them more effectively than any other Titan in the game, which is just an amazing feat when you watch it happen. Flame Core is improved since launch, by the way. It now no longer cares about whether or not an opponent is in the doom state when it hits. Previously, if the opponent had 1 hit point but was not doomed, the Flame Core would simply put them into the doom state and the rest of the damage would be entirely lost. Now, if a Titan with 1 hit point is hit by Flame Core, it dies outright. All the more reason to use the core aggressively, and now it's a great finishing move to ensure you're thoroughly nuking your competition. Finally, we've got Scorch's Thermite Launcher, which is a fantastic tool in its own right, but you've got to know when and how to use it. Most importantly, it allows you to deal with threats that aren't attached to the ground, something Scorch can't exactly do otherwise. Get good at leading your one shot, and you'll have a pretty easy time direct hitting enemy pilots even out to pretty decently far ranges, since this is one of the largest projectiles in the game. Almost as big as Tones, but in all honesty, it is very forgiving. Before we move on to those medium to long range engagements, which you're going to often find more in LTS than other game modes, here's a couple of advanced tips and weird quirks of Scorch that are really important to know, and I feel best presented as just individual little tidbits. First off, Scorch is really big on animation canceling, especially when fighting at longer ranges and relying on your Thermite launcher. Consider raising your thermal shield immediately after firing your primary weapon. This will allow you to protect yourself as much as possible after taking your single pot shot at your opponent. It's honestly not something that I personally use very often, not as often as I should, but I feel it's something that I personally need to get better at, and you guys probably ought to learn to do it as well. You can't always rely on your firewall after all, or can you? If you pay close attention, you'll notice that firewall generally doesn't travel up and over obstacles. Hitting pilots that are slightly elevated off the same floor that you're on is pretty much impossible. However, it is actually possible to get your firewall up onto those slightly elevated areas. Simply walk up until your body is actually touching, say for example on Boomtown, a lot of those buildings that have the really low slanted rooftops. All you've got to do is walk up to that as Scorch, press firewall as you're standing on top of it, and instead of slamming your fist into the ground, you're going to slam your fist on that rooftop, and then the fire will extend over the rooftop. Very, very nice. This same concept actually also applies to flame core, so keep that in mind as well. You can flame core over certain buildings on Boomtown, for example, if you position yourself perfectly. Another weird mechanic is that Firewall has no problem traveling down whatsoever. In fact, if you're standing on top of forward base Kodai, you can both Firewall and flame core opponents down the big hole on top if you space yourself out perfectly. When combining Firewall and Incendiary Trap, do your best to shoot your Firewall tangentially to the Incendiary Trap. Let's review my beautiful artwork that I used in the last guide to illustrate this point once again. I'll do my best to track down some gameplay examples of this that I feel worked really well. Basically, once you really understand how Scorch's positioning works, you can put enemy titans into extremely hopeless and impossible positions by taking advantage of this positioning while walking them down with your thermal shield. You don't even have to hit them with the shield, just walking them down is honestly enough in most situations. Speaking of these impossible situations, and I'm really going to stretch to get some footage of this, sometimes enemy titans realize the awful situation that they're about to be in, and will try to dash into and then past you in order to escape it. Remember that body blocking is a thing. Enemy titans cannot pass through you unless they are Ronin. Use this to your advantage to manually and physically hold an enemy titan in place with your own body so they can't get past you no matter how hard they try. Finally, I've got what is probably the most important quick tip of them all. Please note that Scorch's Incendiary Trap bounces when you shoot it at walls. Use this mechanic to shoot traps around corners, or more insidiously, to bounce them around Tone's particle walls. Whatever point on the wall you choose to bank your Incendiary Trap off of, immediately fire your primary weapon at that exact same spot. The Thermite will drop off the wall, and it's going to be enough to ignite that thermal trap, catching unsuspecting victims with their pants down, and very much so on fire. Moving on, we've also got to recognize that you're not always going to be able to get in close with Scorch. While you usually prefer the close range game, sometimes that's not always a possibility. Next, let's cover the neutral game with Scorch, as you're more likely to experience it in Last Titan Standing. Sometimes, as Scorch, your goal is not actually to be the frontline tank or even the main offense player. You oftentimes don't want to be in the middle lane of a map because you can't handle being shot from multiple angles all that well. You can't possibly get up close and personal with your foes this way. Your goal then is usually going to be to find the best choke point on the map, somewhere well protected that you can operate from. Complex is a great example of this. In LTS on this map, the power position for Scorch lies in the hallway connecting the dome to middle lane. Conveniently, there's a battery there for you to take as well. Do your best to occupy this space and try not to get too aggressive in pushing out of it. Take your time and wait for the other team to make the wrong move, then punish them for it. You gotta maintain patience, unlike me, as I get bored a little bit too easily and end up taking more damage than I ought to in a lot of situations. Watch your team's positioning. If you've got a friendly Ronin who's getting in a little too far over his head, be prepared to burst into the lane and get your heat shield up to try escorting him back out as a really difficult to actually show off example. Not a chance I've got a clip of that, like I just alluded to, but the idea still stands. If you're not being aggressive with Scorch, don't let your thermal shield go to waste. Pop out from a corner, hold the shield up, toss some incendiary traps, and honestly, you can a lot of the time just do nothing at all in addition to that. The enemy team must respond to these traps, plain and simple, whether they are actually ignited or not. If they choose to stand in them because they're not on fire yet, congrats on your free damage once you shoot your primary there. To simplify this even further, you oftentimes are going to just peek out from a corner while holding thermal shield up for no purpose other than to keep an eye on the enemy team, where they're positioning and all that good stuff. The last thing you want is to miss out on a huge incendiary trap combo because you weren't peeking the corner and missed somebody pushing through that really ought not to have been. Just try to remember that, unlike most other Titans, there's some maps where Scorch is just not an option. In last Titan standing situations, he falls flat on Homestead, 4-base Kodai, Blackwater Canal, and in my opinion, and to a little bit lesser of an extent, Eden as well. On these maps, he's got 0 or 1 good lane to take advantage of, and if he gets pushed out of that one spot, he's a sitting duck. Currently, and luckily for Scorch, LTS often occurs on Dry Dock and Complex, the latter of which is absolutely a favorite map of his. In addition to all this, we have to recognize that Scorch just straight up gets hard countered by a good North Star, as well as Ion from range. These Titans are capable of big bursts of damage from very far away, while having great mobility to escape your lackluster long-range damage combos. Your best bet is honestly to just run away from these threats if you can't quickly close the gap, because they're just going to murder you, honestly. No other Titan is hard countered quite as hard as Scorch is, but then again, no other Titan is capable of single-handedly demolishing entire enemy teams in the span of about 10 seconds. You take some and you lose some. Before we sign off on this guide, I did promise that I would talk about Titan kits for Scorch, so let's go ahead and hit on those briefly. I feel like Scorch has an absolute need for Turbo Engine. He's not mobile enough to not have it, in my honest opinion. There's not a world where I'd take Overcore, since you need that dash to set up your Flame Core to begin with in many cases. There's not really a world where I'd take Double Electric Smoke, either. Scorch is fantastic at killing pilots that get too close by using his Flame Shield, and melee is still always an option. Your primary's got a great big hitbox as well. As long as you can see them coming, you've got a kill in the bag more often than not. Otherwise, if they do manage to pull a battery, just remember that an enemy pilot can't go anywhere except straight behind you when they jump off with the battery. Use this knowledge to your advantage and force them to jump off into the worst possible situation so you can easily kill them back and reclaim your battery. Auto-eject makes it harder for you to use Flame Core or to finish off an incendiary trap combo before you die, so I don't feel like even that is worth using and losing the dash over. You're just going to die faster because without that dash, you're dealing less damage because you're not able to be as aggressive, all at the cost of lowering your Titan's overall life by skipping the Doom State. Seems like a penalty more than a buff to me. You're not fast enough for nuclear ejection either, so don't even waste your time with that. As for the Scorch-specific kit, as I stated in the beginning, I feel like Inferno Shield is just honestly your only viable option. You don't necessarily need the damage it provides, but the duration is so inherently important to making Scorch playable that it's just impossible, in my opinion, to not take it. His other kits aren't necessarily even that bad. Extra duration on Firewall is a great little benefit to have if you can really take advantage of it, but honestly, at what cost? Dropping extra Thermite out of your primary weapon, again, could be useful, but at what cost? Same story with extra damage from Flame Core. I just don't feel like the benefits of these kits outweigh the loss of not having the improved heat shield. If Scorch were to ever be buffed, with the duration from the Inferno Shield kit becoming baseline and the Inferno Shield kit only buffing the damage when you select it, I'd actually consider taking another kit. However, in Scorch's current state, I just can't bring myself to use anything that does not buff the duration of that shield because it's so inherently important to how Scorch is actually played at a higher level. You need that duration so badly. And if you don't have it, Scorch just sucks, in my opinion. Anyways, everyone, that'll do it for the Scorch guide. If there's anything that I missed out on which you feel could have been covered, I can't wait to see you discussing it in the comments section down below. Like all my videos, this guide does not end when the video does. Stick around in the comment section down below, and you'll learn plenty of stuff from other players' viewpoints, as well as some clarifications from me as well, all of which are valid and helpful. I hope that you all learned something new today, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.